Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jana Dietz.
Good afternoon. I'm Jana Dietz with the John W. Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. The Kluge Center welcomes leading scholars from around the world to work in residence, make use of the library's incomparable collections, and engage in conversations on the challenges facing democracies. We are delighted to partner with the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, provided with support from the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission, to celebrate the anniversary of women's right to vote by offering this 100 Years of Women Voting Symposium. Ratified on August 26, 1920, the 19th Amendment reads, "The right of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of sex." To reach this point, it took a sustained organizing effort of nearly 100 years at the state and federal levels to achieve ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. For the women who took part, it also meant tremendous personal sacrifice. The portrait monument in the U.S. Capitol Rotunda features suffrage pioneers Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, serving as a reminder of past successes and possibilities for the future. Black suffrage leaders such as Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, and Mary Church Terrell fought also for women's right to vote, making lasting contributions to expanding suffrage for all women. This symposium honors the legacy of this fight for women's right to vote. Over the course of this 6-week series, we'll hear from scholars who study women's political participation and from women leaders themselves. Join us as we analyze and discuss how suffrage for women influenced American politics, listening to the wide range of women's voices we hear today in neighborhoods and cities, in states, and across the nation. This symposium will be recorded and will also be available online at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society's website, so please share with others who may be interested. I would now like to introduce Jane Campbell, President and CEO of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, who will begin today's program. Jane.
Okay, Jane, go.
Thank you, Jenna. It is a delight to welcome you to this symposium, and it has been an absolute pleasure working with the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress and the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission.
Oh, now I have it.
We decided when we put our minds to what we would do for this symposium to honor the 100th anniversary, that there were an awful lot of people who were talking about the struggle for suffrage and the struggle to pass the 19th Amendment itself. But that what we needed to do was to add to the conversation what happened next, which is why we started on the day after Women's Equality Day. And over this next 6 weeks, we are looking at what happened once women got the right to vote. Intentionally, as you look at the panels, we have brought focus on matters of race and gender, matters of class and gender, what happened with Native Americans, what happened with women's political participation, not just voting, but participating in other ways. And so we will look at what has happened over the arc of 100 years. We are very fortunate to have, for the opening keynote, a woman who has just published a book called A Century of Votes for Women, American Elections Since Suffrage. And so we are honored that Christina Wolbrecht is our opening keynote. Dr. Wolbrecht is a professor of political science, the director of the Rooney Center for the Study of American Democracy, and the Robert and Margaret Hanley Family Director of the Notre Dame Washington Program. Dr. Wolbrecht has been a person who has been in much demand over this last year as one organization after the other has tried to understand what does it mean that women got the right to vote, how did they do it, how hard was it, and what changed? Did anything change? And so we are honored to have Dr. Wolbrecht, who continues to look at what changed and what is changing even today as we look at the election that we're going into in 2020. So we welcome you. We welcome Dr. Wolbrecht. What we will do, just so you're aware, she will make her presentation. You may enter your questions into the Q&A. And when she's done with her presentation, I will put those questions to her. So please, as the questions come to you, put them there, but we will deal with them at the end. Thank you very much. Dr. Wolbrecht, take it away.
Thank you. It's my honor to be here. And I love that Jane mentioned that we're here on the day after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, because as a scholar, that's really where my own work begins. There are many brilliant women and some men who have analyzed and helped us understand the great complexities of the suffrage movement. And I'm here to tell you what happens next. And I'm hoping that everything sounds good and is working okay. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Give me just a second. I am a modern professor, which means I can only speak if there are slides sort of present. And so, as Jane says, I'm going to talk today about sort of what happens next. And a lot of this is based on my book, collaborative with my colleague Kevin Corder, A Century of Votes for Women, in which we try to answer this question. What have women done with the vote? So I'm going to start by actually giving away a bit of the answer. And I'm seeing what the problem is right now. Are you getting big blocks there? We're going to get rid of that. And that might be a little better. Only a little better. Thank you for your patience. This is our life in 2020. And we're having all sorts of problems, aren't we? Sorry about that. There we go. I'm going to start with some spoilers for you. I'm going to start by telling you in advance what I'm going to tell you. And so the first thing I'm going to tell you is that one of the things we're going to see over this next 100 years since the ratification of the 19th Amendment is the persistence of gender stereotypes, expectations about how women related to politics, what sort of political role they had, et cetera. These ideas, of course, were the main reason why women were not granted the right to vote prior to some early states, and then via the 19th Amendment in 1920. And one of the things I want to emphasize today is these ideas about women voters don't just go away as soon as women get the right to vote. The other thing I want to emphasize, or the other point we want to make sure to make, is that there is no woman voter. Since before suffrage, the press, politicians, parties, everyone's tried to understand who is the woman voter? How can we understand women voters? And one of the things I hope that I'll convince you of today is that there really is no one woman voter, but rather there are lots of different kinds of women, and they have different kinds of experiences once they enter polling places. All right. So everyone, I think on this call is familiar with the 19th Amendment that was ratified, of course, on August 26, 1920. Of course, immediately after ratification, the question became, what will women voters do, right? Now that we've given, now that women have secured the ballot for themselves, and of course, it's not quite that easy or straightforward, what are women going to do with the ballot? And what we can see over the past 100 years is lots of ideas about how women are going to use the ballot. These are headlines from the 20s with the petticoat reference through until the 2000 presidential election. Constant speculation, right? This is a big part of the electorate, more than half of the electorate, in fact. How will women vote? Will she be wise? Does it matter about different groups of women, et cetera? Now, it didn't take very long after the ratification of the 19th Amendment and the first presidential election of 1920 for women, when women entered polling places, for the press and politicians to come to some pretty clear conclusions about what women were doing with the vote. And the first conventional wisdom, almost immediately, these are headlines from 1923 and 1924, was that women's suffrage had been a failure. I've had people refer to this as sort of the Twitter hot takes of the 20s. And this idea was really widespread. You're seeing headlines there from Good Housekeeping to the Washington Post to Harper's Magazine. That basically this grand experiment, this 70-year struggle for the right to vote had ended in failure. It wasn't just the press that believed this, and this is going to be another theme today, but that it turns out that social scientists like myself are subject to the same sorts of stereotypes and assumptions as other people looking at electoral politics. And so this is an article by some sociologists from July 1924, and the title really says everything you need to know. Women are just ineffective in their use of the vote. Now, this was an analysis of one election in one state, but there was so little data at this time that this really became the basis for our knowledge about women voters for a very long time. So if you were me and you were lucky enough to go look at a bunch of American politics textbooks from the 1950s and 1960s, they would all basically say women really didn't take up the vote, they didn't vote very much. And if you followed those citations back, they're all going to come to this particular article because we had so little data in this period to look at. What do we mean when we say women's suffrage was a failure? This quote comes from a book by Frederick Lou Allen, Only Yesterday, which was a very popular history of the 1920s. And Allen really sums it up. The American woman won the suffrage in 1920. She seemed, it is true, to be very little interested in it once she had it. That is to say, women didn't turn out to vote, right? That all these women had fought so hard and endured so much to get women the right to vote, and most women didn't bother voting. Now, on the face of it, there's some evidence to support that. This is coming from some detailed work that Kevin and I did in our first book, Counting Women's Ballots, that looks at these first 5 presidential elections after suffrage. And what you're seeing in the purple line is the percentage of women who turned out to vote in those 5 presidential elections, and in the mustard yellow, the percentage of men who turned out to vote in those 5 elections. There's no question that men's turnout, which reaches more than 70% by the end of this period, was higher than women's turnout that starts in 1920 at less than 40%, right? And this is a pretty big gap and a difference. You'll notice as both men's and women's turnout increases over time, women's increases at a slightly faster rate. And so that gap is narrowing over time. Nonetheless, if we were just to look at these overall data, we would perhaps conclude that, oh, I guess you're right. Most women didn't want the ballot and didn't take advantage of it when they had it. But you'll remember, I already told you what the second point of this presentation was going to be, and that's that there's no one women voter. That women are diverse in, you'll be surprised to hear, all of the same ways that men are diverse. And one way we might think about women's diversity in the 1920s was in terms of geographic diversity. That women who won the right to vote in Louisiana were different than women who won the right to vote in Maine and in Illinois. Not only because they likely came from different communities and had different backgrounds, but because they entered very different political contexts. One of the most important things to understand about voting rights is that the Constitution actually says very little about them. 15th Amendment that enfranchises people of color, 19th Amendment that removes prohibitions on the basis of sex. But really the administration of elections is left to the states. And it turns out it varied a great deal. It mattered a great deal which state a woman lived in when she first, when the 19th Amendment had first been ratified. So what this graph is showing you is the turnout of women in purple and men in yellow in 10 different states in 1920. We've got Virginia on the left, Massachusetts and Connecticut, up through Kentucky on the right. So what I would want you to see to begin with is that in every state, men are more likely to turn out, than are women. That said, there's huge variation across women over time. So in Virginia, for example, in 1920, fewer than 10% of women turned out to vote in that election. We're not doing a whole lot better in Massachusetts or Connecticut, where just barely 20% of women turn out to vote in the first election in which they're eligible. On the other hand, if we look at places like Missouri or Kentucky, more than half of women turn out to vote in that first election in which they're eligible. So the question is, how can we explain or understand these differences? Excuse me for 1 second, I'm getting a little, all right. What makes the experience of women in Missouri and Kentucky different from the experience of women in places like Virginia and Massachusetts? One important difference between these different states has to do with their, excuse me, we're going to go back one, with the laws in which, sort of the legal structure in which women entered the electorate. In this graph, in states that are shown by the yellow graph, these are states that had really restrictive election laws. This is going to include, of course, Virginia, which is part of the Jim Crow South during this period. The South really cannot be considered a real democracy during this period and discourages across the board electoral participation, but of course directs most of that those prohibitions against people of color in the South. And this is the reason why when we talk about Black women, it's really important to say that most Black women continued to live under Jim Crow during these periods and did not in a real way have the right to vote until after the 1965 Voting Rights Act. This also includes states like Massachusetts and Connecticut that had similar sorts of restrictive voting laws in order to suppress the votes of recent immigrants. In 1920, something like 60% of women in Massachusetts and Connecticut were first or second generation immigrants. So if you have poll taxes, if you have literacy tests, if you have long registration or residency requirements, these are going to bear particularly hard on racial minorities and also on immigrants. What you can see in this graph is that for both men and women, living in those restrictive states leads to lower turnout. But the difference for men of 19 points, a 19-point difference in turnout between states that don't have those barriers and states that do, is even larger among women. And we can sort of imagine why that might be. That women, that families that can barely afford to pay a poll tax are probably only going to pay it for the male head of household and not for the wife or the mother. That if you're already a voter who has little experience going, registering, showing up to vote on election day, you might be particularly kept back by the threats of things, again, like literacy tests or poll taxes. It just makes the entire experience more challenging. The other thing that distinguishes these states where a lot of women turned out and these states where very few women turned out is how competitive the elections were. This is a period in which most states are really dominated by one party or the other. That comes to a dramatic extreme in the South, so states like Virginia, in which the Democratic Party dominates the state. Those are purple states in this particular figure showing women's and men's turnout. The mustard yellow states are states that were dominated by the Republican Party, not quite to the extent as Democrats dominated their state, but nonetheless very, very dominated by the Republican Party. And then we just have a few states here shown in the dark green that were truly competitive. This includes Kentucky, where in 1920, that state's electoral college votes were decided by 0.05% of the vote. What do we know about close elections? When there are close elections, voters believe that their vote counts, right? They have a reason to think it really makes a difference if I show up on election day. Perhaps even more importantly, when an election is close, the parties have an incentive to mobilize voters, to go out and encourage every person that can possibly vote to show up on election day, including, of course, women. And we see again that for both men and women, as you move from a very uncompetitive state to a more competitive state, turnout goes up. But that's especially true for women. So we have this much bigger sort of jump as women move into these more competitive states. When they were mobilized, when parties encouraged them to turn out, when elections were really salient, even the very first women voters, more than half of them showed up on election day. So what should we conclude from this? What I want to point out is that the difference between different groups of women, Kentucky women and Virginia women, was almost 50 points. The likelihood that you were going to turn out in Virginia was 50-point difference than the likelihood you as a woman would turn out in Kentucky. It's important to note that in none of these states is the difference between men and women that large. So men and women in states were closer together to each other than women are to voters in other states. We can see that overall as well. The turnout gap overall in 1920 was about 32 points. Again, there's a bigger difference between women depending on where they live than on the fact that they're women and not men. Gender matters. We saw in all of those states that women turned out less than men did, but it's not the only thing that matters. And so other aspects of women's lives and aspects of men's lives are going to shape turnout, in some cases to an even greater extent than gender alone. It's important to note that that narrowing we saw across those first 5 elections continues. And so by 1980, women had become more likely to turn out than men, and that has persisted through until our most recent presidential election. And I think we have every reason to expect that that will continue in 2020 as well. And I'm happy to talk more about that as we move forward. It turns out that wasn't the only conventional wisdom. So I'm returning to this quote by Frederick Lou Allen in 1931. She seems, it is true, to be very little interested in the ballot. She voted, but mostly as the unregenerate men about her did. I do appreciate this. Allen is basically saying women can be as bad at choosing candidates as men can be. But this idea that women really don't vote any differently, that they vote exactly the same as men, which was an argument made before suffrage, takes on a very particular tone. So it's not just that women voted like men, but specifically they voted like their husbands, and they voted like their husbands because their husbands tell them how to vote. This first headline is from the Boston Globe in 1920. The second headline is from the Detroit Free Press in 1952. This is an idea that persists a very long time, that women must be voting as they're told to vote by their husbands. This assumption, this persistent stereotype that women are not interested in politics, that men are the heads of a patriarchal traditional family structure, that women take political direction from their husbands, have real consequences for our own understanding of voting and elections. George Gallup in the 1930s and 1940s is basically inventing survey research. And what George Gallup wants to do in his political polls is understand how people decide who they're going to vote for. So he's going to ask them about their issue preferences. He's going to ask them about their backgrounds, their religious traditions. Do they belong to a union? All these aspects of interests and identities that we know come together to determine the choices people make in politics. George Gallup chose to purposefully undersample women. And the reason was he didn't think there was anything to understand. He didn't need to ask women about their positions on different policy issues or their backgrounds or their experiences, because women, as he says in this quote, just vote as their husbands tell them to vote. And so when we try to use these data from the 30s and the 40s, it's actually hard for us to understand how women voted because the data isn't always as rich or as full as it should be, because pollsters like Gallup thought there was really no point to asking women about their political positions. Once again, this is not, and you probably can't read all these words, and I really don't want you to. This is another scholars agreed slide for you. As these new polls are being done in the 40s and the 50s, we get the first academic studies of voting rights, our first ideas of how do American voters understand the political world and how do they choose candidates to support. These studies, the classic study Voting here in 1954, the American Voter in 1960, these are books that, if you're lucky enough to go to graduate school in political science, are still being read to this day. They still shape how we think about voters. And all of these classic first works all agree. Men tell women how to vote, right? So I'll just look at the first one. The men discuss politics with their wives. That is, they tell them. I want you to really watch that quote. They discuss politics. That is, they tell them, but they do not particularly respect them. On the side of wives, there is trust. On the side of the husbands, there is the need to reply or guide. So what is the evidence, right? We got all these new surveys. We finally figured out how to sample people nationally. Everyone's got a telephone. We're doing really pioneering work here in trying to understand the population and its political attitudes. This is the actual graph that comes from the book with that first quote, but it's really the extent of evidence period across any of these studies. what this graph is showing you is that in July and in October, women in the dark bars were more likely to say that they discussed politics with a family member than men were. That is literally the question wording. Would you go to a family member to discuss a political question? Is the first survey. Who is the last person you discussed politics with? Right? So let me be clear that this question, that this survey does not ask, did you tell your wife how to vote? Did your husband tell you to vote? Do you trust your husband? Do you respect your husband's political views? Do you defer to your husband? If you're the husband, do you think it's your job to guide your wife in her political decisions? It is entirely possible that this was true in many households during this or any other period, that in some cases, men did tell their wives how to vote. We can't necessarily, however, conclude that from the evidence we have in front of us. All we know is that women are more likely to say that they discuss politics with a family member than men are. It might be worth remembering that during this period, men were, of course, more likely to work outside the home than were women. And so simply the probability that the last person you happened to discuss politics with was a family member was probably higher for women than it was for men. We might come up with a different hypothesis to understand why it is that men and women who are married tend to vote the same way. And I should say that remains true to this day. This is and let me just say, the scholars, this idea would not have been entirely brand new to them. This is a New York Times article from October of 1956, a long piece on women voters. And in the bolded part, the author says, if married couples tend to vote the same way, and they do, it is because their environment gives them the same orientation rather than because the woman rubber stamps the man's choice. Marriage, you might be aware, is not a random assignment to a relationship, right? We tend to vote people who we tend to marry people who share our values, our religious traditions, our backgrounds, live in the same part of the country, have the same level of education, work in the same sorts of jobs, etc. Not always, but in general, right? We tend to see these sorts of patterns. So those same characteristics that shape our understanding of politics and our preferences about politics are shaping our marriage choices as well. And it might be that you vote the same as your husband as I do, more because you share a lot of views and values than anything else. Now, it can be very picky to look at scholars and newspaper headlines from the 50s and from the 20s and say, of course, right? People had all these biases then, and the data wasn't so great. And they really were sort of figuring things out. But now, my goodness, by 2020, surely we've gotten past all this and have a more sophisticated understanding among the press, among politicians, et cetera, about how women voters enter the electorate and with what impact. And so we come to 2016, and this is in lots of important ways, truly a historic election, right? So on the Republican side, we have a candidate who, unlike all other nominees for at least 100 years, had not held either military office or elected office in the past, and who was accused of, who had said and was credibly accused of doing some pretty terrible things when it comes to women. On the other hand, we have Hillary Clinton, who is the first woman nominee of a major party, and also a real lightning rod for concerns about women's issues, women's place, sort of the disruption and these tensions that we have over gender roles in our culture. So surely we're going to have an enormous gender gap, right? There's got to be this big difference, right? Think of the assumptions that are behind these headlines, that women would, of course, vote for a woman candidate, that women, of course, would be more likely than men to not vote for Trump because of the things he said about women. That probably doesn't affect men voters, but surely that's going to affect women voters because women, right, their relationship to politics is so dominated by their gender. So let's take a look at the actual gender gap. So what this graph is showing you is from 1952 until 2012 in this graph, the percent of women who voted Democratic minus the percent of men who voted Democratic. And so what that means is that when that line is lower than 0, and that's, I'm pointing at my screen like you can see it, lower than 0, below that 0 line, women are actually more Republican. And that's true in the 40s, 40s and the 50s through to the 1960 election. Women were slightly more likely to vote for the Republican candidate for president than they were for the Democratic candidate. This is actually true around the globe. It's often referred to as the traditional gender gap. And what that is then that many advanced industrial democracies, right after women were granted suffrage, women were more likely to favor center-right parties than they were to favor center-left or left parties. This is usually attributed to women's religious traditionalism, and I'd be happy to talk about that more. But we're moving on to 2016. Starting in at least 1980, we enter into this period in which women are consistently more likely to vote Democratic than men are. And so this is known as the modern gender gap. This is also something we see cross-nationally, that women are more likely to favor center-left and left parties than men are, and certainly something we see in the United States as well. So we come into 2016. It's this remarkable election. Surely the gender gap is going to be of historic proportions. So I'm now going to show you the 2016 gender gap, and I want you to just prepare yourselves for this. Did you miss it? Let me show it to you again. The gender gap in 2016 was in no way outside of sort of historical patterns. And the question is why, right? We assume that all these women are going to vote against Donald Trump and for Hillary Clinton. What actually happened? Now, it's not as if the press and our scholars haven't learned something over time. And so one of the things they've learned is that, right, women are not all the same. And one of the important ways in which women and men are different in American politics is, of course, race. And we get all these headlines after the 2016 election. Why did white women specifically vote for Donald Trump? And these articles are really phrased as, what happened? Is it that Donald Trump is so appealing to women? How can we explain this behavior? So the first thing to say when we talk about why white women voted for Donald Trump is that white women have consistently voted for the Republican presidential candidate since about 1952. So this is again showing percentage support among white women in mustard, Black women in purple, showing the percent voting Republican in each presidential election from 52 to 2016. There's going to be variation, but you can see that that yellow line is almost always above 50%, which is to say white women are almost always voting, a majority are voting for the Republican candidate. Got two examples, exceptions there, 1964, which was an unprecedented landslide for the Democratic Party, and then Clinton's re-election in 1996. I'm happy to come back and talk about those if folks would like to. Let's look a little bit closer though. When you look at the gender gap, the differences between men and women, it's hard to see who is actually moving. And I think this is a really important point to make. When we say women and men vote differently, the presumption is usually women do something different, right? Men are normal and women are more democratic. When of course, and is what is actually true, is the original gender gap was less that women became more democratic, women stayed pretty similarly democratic and men became more Republican. And so we want to look for those same sort of patterns. Who's actually moving to understand what happened in 2016? So what this graph is showing you is the Republican share, the percent Republican of the major party vote for whites in 2012 and for African-American voters in 2012. And I want you to notice two things about this graph. One, there is a gender gap among African-Americans and among whites, that among most racial groups, among most education groups, among most income groups, racial and ethnic groups, you name it, there is still a higher propensity for men to vote Republican than women. And so it's not that gender doesn't matter, but it is the case that that gender gap, that difference between men and women who are white and men and women who are Black, is much, much smaller and is dwarfed considerably by the difference between white men and African-American men and white women and African-American women. Said another way, white women vote much more similarly to white men than they vote to African-American women. So what happened in 2016? Among whites, we see almost no change. This historic, unprecedented election, and really the patterns don't look that different. So this is that same data, men in yellow, women in purple, for white men and women in 2016. We're seeing something very similar in the African American community. And I should say, most of us, I think, would read this as, rather than the slight increases that you're seeing there, suggesting a great deal of enthusiasm in the African American community for Donald Trump. It's more of a story that in 2008 and 2012, overwhelming percentages of African American voters supported President Obama. And what we're seeing in 2016 is sort of a return to a more normal distribution of Black votes. Now, we've looked at racial differences, which are big. We've looked at geographic differences, which are big. It turns out that there's even more dimensions, that women are complicated in lots of different ways, again, as men are. So I want to take a little bit closer look at these white voters who, from this graph, just looking at white men and white women, seem to have not moved at all between 2012 and 2016. But the story is a little bit more complicated. This graph shows only white women, white voters, male and female. On the left, white men and white women without a college degree. On the right, white women and white men who have a college degree. We've increasingly seen a number of sort of dimensions emerging powerfully in our politics. Education is one of them. Rural-urban division is part of this as well. But for just sort of ease, I'm going to focus here on college attainment. So it's certainly the case in 2012 that on average, whites without a college degree are highly likely to vote for the Republican Party. Whites with a college degree less so, but still a majority. So what's going to happen in 2016? We're going to see, and you've probably heard about this, a quite significant increase, a swing to Donald Trump among whites who do not have a college degree. But I want you to look really closely at what's happened here. That yellow bar for white men without a college degree in 2012 and the same in 2016 goes up, but just a little bit. And in fact, those confidence intervals overlap, which suggests that's probably not even a significant difference. Look instead at that purple line, that purple bar for white women without a college degree in 12 and white women without a college degree in 2016. That is a pretty significant increase, and in fact, a statistically significant increase. So since the 2016 election, we've had all of these reporters in diners talking to working class men, trying to understand their support for Trump and if they still support him. I think one of the things this data tells us is that they need to be talking to the waitresses and the women working as RNAs and all sorts of other jobs instead of the working class men, because it's really working class women and their shift that makes a difference in 2016. And I'm quite confident that the Trump team right now is doing a lot of emphasis on how do we keep those voters. You'll notice, in fact, that white women without a college degree move so much to Trump that there's actually not a modern gender gap between whites without a college degree in 2016. So what happens amongst white voters with a college degree? Here we've got to swing the opposite direction. Again, both men and women become a little bit less likely to vote Republican in 2016. The difference is barely statistical among men, but it is pretty significant among women. The white women with a college degree already not very likely to vote Republican, they become much less likely to vote Republican in 2016. So again, looking at women as just a group, even looking at white women as just a group, misses important changes and developments that matter for how women's votes are impacting elections. I'm going to show the same data for Black voters, but mostly to make a point. What you're going to see here is that Black women without a college degree actually did in fact become more likely, like white women without a college degree, to vote Republican in 2016. So we see that same pattern. We also see that same pattern for Black women with college degrees. They actually became less likely. The fact that there's no black line there means those estimates are basically zero in 2016 of college-educated Black men or women who voted for Trump. The reason that those black lines are so big and it's really hard to see the patterns is that we actually, this is, again, I have to make these research points. We need better data about minority populations. When we survey 2,000 people, we can estimate the electorate overall quite well. Once we cut them in half, male and female, and then we cut out the different minority populations, and then we look at men and women, and then we look at college educated and not, it gets really hard for us to accurately understand the political behavior of minority voters. As we're sort of facing this growing diversity, we've always had a diverse electorate. We need to do better, and I'm happy to say that there are efforts to do better on this front. So let me finish up by asking, what will women do in 2020? And the answer is that slide is blank for a reason. This is, 2020 is only going to outdo 2016 as a unique and historic election. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We are talking about access to the ballot, about vote by mail, about post offices, about racial and ethnic justice. There's a lot going on. As a social scientist, I know the best predictor of the future is the past. But I think there's going to be a lot of interesting and important things happening between today and election day. And with that, I'm going to end, and I look forward to your questions and our discussion.
Well, Christina, this is lovely. You've certainly given us a lot to think about.
I get that response a lot. There's a lot of data. I hope I didn't overwhelm everybody.
No, I just judging by the Q&A room, we're getting a couple of questions, and one person asked this question. So, do you have any information about what was it that non-college white women found so attractive about now President Trump as they went to vote?
So this is a great question, and I want to give a shout out to Erin Cassese at the University of Delaware, and Tiffany Barnes, Mary Holman. These are all scholars who have written on these questions and really helped us understand women voters in 2016. And the answer is that 2016 was unique in the degree to which racist attitudes and sexist attitudes predicted vote choice, even with party held constant. And what I want to say about that, I think that that question lets me make a really important point, or reiterate another really important point about women as voters and about women in general, which is that, again, women are diverse. So many women economically or racially saw supporting Donald Trump in their best interest as they defined it, even if it maybe wasn't in their best interest as women. But it's also important to say that many of the measures we have, sorry folks, I'm just having a really good day, so we're gonna lose our light in the middle of this too. So let me get back on track. Many white women express views that we would consider today sexist as well. The sense that women complain or say things are sexism when they really aren't, that women should be protected by men. All these, we call these sort of benevolent and hostile sexism. And it turns out that those views are more likely to be held by women without a college degree, and that those views are highly predictive of voting for Donald Trump in 2020. And so it was interesting last night, I didn't watch, but my understanding is there was, First Lady Melania Trump and others sort of talking about and to women. And certainly that's part of Trump's efforts to sort of reach more broadly in 2020.
One of the questions that is on people's mind is, at what point did political candidates start to reach out to women as voters, trying to make a plea to their issues, their concerns? We clearly see that now, but when did that start?
So I love this question because it lets me make some just really important points. And so the first I want to say is from the very beginning, We see candidates. There's this new group in the electorate. Nobody knows them. What are women going to do? The stereotype is that women are very flighty. So some of the big opposition to women's suffrage, for example, comes from political party machines. They're like, oh, we don't know what these voters are going to do. And we really live on controlling our voters. What politicians and the press believe about women voters is in some ways as or even more important to their political power and influence than how women actually behave. What do I mean by that? So in 1920, Republican candidate Harding introduced all sorts of planks to the Republican platform meant to appeal to women about prohibition, about equal pay. We've been talking about equal pay for 100 years, folks. About equal pay, about child labor, about child education, the things that people believed women cared about. We get the Shepherd-Towner Act, which is about maternity and infant health in 1921 as an appeal to women voters. We get the Cable Act in 1923 that says you're a woman and you marry an immigrant, you no longer lose your American citizenship. Yes, that used to be the law. And then the politicians and the press sort of decide, oh, but women aren't really voting as a bloc and only about 30% of them seem to be voting. I guess we don't have to do that anymore. And for a while, they don't. So the Shepherd-Towner Act, for example, expires in 1929 and no one bothers to do anything about it. We hear about women don't want to send their sons to war in World War II and in Korea, women as consumers when there's concerns about prices, these sorts of things. So there's a consistent set of appeals. But the impact and the degree to which candidates really focus on women depends on believing that their votes make a difference and that they are really paying attention. So at the end of the 60s and the early 70s, the rise of the second wave of the women's movement, we get a lot more both claims about women voters, the things we're going to do, and then we do a bunch of stuff. It's not a coincidence that we get Title IX of the Education Act, we get pregnancy discrimination law, we get the Equal Rights Amendment, all those things. And then we get another movement. We get social conservatives organizing as a movement, and they convince a lot of politicians that there are other women voters who care about other things, right? And we go in a different direction. And so what we believe about women voters really determines how much those concerns are paid attention to. I'll make one more point, and it's really one of the reasons we wrote this book. So we saw all these appeals to women as mothers in the 1920s, and Kevin and I were doing our work in the last 2 decades, and what do we see in politics ourselves? Soccer moms, hockey moms, security moms, right? We are still 100 years later talking about women as if they're all moms, they all live in the suburbs, and they all care mostly about their children. The percentage of women who are white, that's usually the soccer mom ideal, live in the suburbs and have children. It's never been a majority of women voters, and it's only been declining over time.
Well, let's just take it from where you were with the conservative voters. There are 2 questions. One is about what kind of influence do you see of religion on women voters, which also has a different racial connotation, the kind of engagement of religion and politics in the African American community has been let justice roll down like waters, but in the white community, it's more been narrowly focused on abortion. How do you see those 2 things playing out?
So, as you probably know, women remain more likely to express religious values, to hold religious beliefs, to be the ones taking their families to religious services. There is certainly no question that different religious traditions understand the implications of those beliefs for political engagement and political position taking in different ways. And you did a really nice job there, Jane, of course, of sort of summarizing that. I would emphasize some other things about religion that also sort of shape women's engagement and impact. And one of them is the impact of churches as places where the communities come together, where there are networks, and there's empowerment, frankly. So in the Black church, for example, this really strong tradition of commitment to social justice and to activism. In the United States, the group with the highest turnout is white women, and only slightly behind them, and it may not survive this election, are Black women. They turn out at a higher rate than white men do. This is despite the fact that Black women remain more likely to be poor, more likely to be single-headed heads of households, lots of things that we normally think of as making it less likely that you turn out to vote. And the scholars, there's really my colleague Nadia Brown, who may be part of your discussion later in this series, and some others have shown that it's really the community formed in churches and other places, and that sense of duty to the community that really inspires Black women to such a high rate of electoral participation. The flip is, there's lots of great work on how in conservative religious traditions, the emphasis on a more traditional family and with a husband at the lead and making decisions also has implications for those women's political engagement. That when you're not empowered within your own family, you're less likely to see yourself as empowered in politics as well. So you're less likely to participate and so on. And so religion is hugely important because it's hugely important to so many people's lives.
And so looking ahead, I mean, one of the questions, especially in 2018, wasn't a presidential year, was a congressional year that had incredible participation by women as candidates. And so what do you see that women operate differently with women as candidates? Now, the experience with Hillary Clinton, that didn't quite transfer. Were there issues related to class that affected how women responded to Hillary? And what's your perspective on women as candidates?
So we don't know much about women. Well, let me say this. We don't know much about how voters respond to women presidential candidates because we've had so very few of them. But we've had a lot of women run for the US Senate and especially for the US House. And the evidence that women, leaving everything else equal, are more likely to vote for women candidates as a result of them being women, like this is why, is slim to none. There is really just not a lot of reason to expect that a woman voter looks at a choice and says, well, I agree with this other male candidate in terms of his partisanship or his positions on the issues or whatever it might be, but I'm going to vote for this candidate because she's a woman. We just really don't see a lot of that happening. It's more complicated in primary elections, right, where there's no partisanship. But even there, I would say the recent trend is that Democrats seem enthusiastic about women candidates in general, Democratic men and women, whereas you don't get any sort of bump for being a female candidate in Republican primaries, for example. And I think this is another example of, right, when we think about women, do we assume that they engage with politics centrally as women? Or do they also engage with politics as members of a religious tradition, of a racial background? Do they see their interests in other ways, right? And so I may be a woman, but if I agree with the male candidate on these issues or our shared partisanship, that really is going to be a trump. And as, I did not mean that pun, as I suggested, that the patterns are a little bit different for African-American voters who historically have really rallied behind the Black and minority candidates, especially Black candidates. And we saw some of that with President Obama in 08 and 12.
We are coming toward the end. We're going to do two more questions, Christina, so we'll do these quickly.
Well, I will do my best.
And I will tell you that the next section, the next panel is on race and gender in politics. So some of the questions that people have about the polling techniques that are especially targeted to how do we deal with understanding minority participation may be addressed in that next adventure.
Let me just say this really quick. When I say that, all I mean is that you've got to oversample minority populations, and there are surveys that do that. So if you really want to be able to break down and look at the diversity within minority populations, you can't just survey 100 of them or 200 of them or even 500 of them. You've got to have a much more sample. So when I say survey techniques, I mostly mean just spending the money. Every single person in your survey costs you money, but spending the money to make sure you're reaching into the Black community, reaching into Asian communities, Hispanic communities, etc.
And so 2 questions. Does age, do you see anything with age, and do you see any more sort of what they now, the Washington Post called the household vote? Does that household vote, does that have an age component? Is that a real thing these days? Or is it just that we tend to marry people we agree with?
So on age is really important for understanding this first century of women as voters. By that I mean that 19th Amendment comes along in 1920, and you've got lots of women in the electorate in their 30s, 40s, and 50s who came into political age, and then it would have been 21, with women not voting, with not seeing women vote, with not expecting that women would vote, with not thinking that women voting would be normal. And that's going to have long-term consequences. So 2 big developments. The story of turnout across 100 years is women's turnout growing to the point where it surpasses men. And the cause of that is almost entirely replacement. As older women who didn't think of themselves as voters, who never got past those stereotypes, leave the electorate, and newer, younger generations come in who are seeing women voting, et cetera, those younger generations are much more likely to vote. And so it's really just a generational change story over the 20th century. The story for women's vote choice and age is different. It is really among all women, regardless of their age, that we see women in the 60s and the 70s compared to men, becoming more Democratic and men becoming more Republican. And if we had another hour, I'd be happy to talk about why that is. There are still differences.
Christina, we could talk to you. We could talk to you for another hour and another 2 hours.
I did write a whole book about this, so you can.
And so what we will do is the recording will be posted on the website of the Capitol Historical Society within 24 hours. And we'll have information about the book, so that if someone is interested in reading the whole book, they can join that. And we do hope that this has sparked your interest in our series, and that you will join us next week as we engage in a conversation about race and gender in politics over the last 100 years, where we have a combination of Marcia Fudge, who is an elected member of Congress, served as a mayor, and is an African-American woman who will speak clearly that she is both. You cannot talk to her about being a woman or being an African-American. She is both. And Andrea Gillespie from Emory University, Kathleen Cahill from Penn State, moderated by Liat Gidlow from Harvard and Wayne State. So it is going to be a top-notch panel. We hope you will join us for the next panel and for all the panels to come. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jana, and all the folks at the Library of Congress for participating with us, and to the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission for their support in making this possible. Have a good day, and don't forget to vote.
Perfect. Let's take it.